Good evening, community. My story happened when I was a truck driver. I had a job where I was doing really well. I lived with my wife and my mother. We hadn't thought about having kids yet since we were still young. My late father helped me get that job through a contact in the company, something I will always be grateful for. My mother was also a wonderful person and loved my wife as if she were her own daughter. At work, I got along well with everyone. Everything seemed perfect, but something strange was happening. I tried hard to convince myself it was just my imagination, but my instincts told me otherwise. I constantly felt like I was being watched almost all the time from the moment I left my house. I can't quite explain it, but that feeling wouldn't go away, no matter what. My suspicions grew when, during night shifts, I was being passed by black cars accompanied by motorcycles. It was a long, dark road, not the kind where you'd expect to see motorcycles in the middle of the night. And it didn't happen just once, but several times. Something inside me told me it wasn't right. Something was out of the ordinary, but I didn't know what it was. One night I decided to tell my wife about it, and she told me she felt the same way whenever she went to work. She was a teacher, and noticed that sometimes black cars would park in front of the school, making her feel watched and uncomfortable. I completely understood what she meant, and I realized it wasn't a coincidence. So, we went to the police because we felt like we were in danger. But that wasn't my only concern. My boss gave me a day off because apparently my truck's GPS wasn't working, and they needed to fix it, so I didn't make any deliveries that day. I spent the day resting. I was really exhausted from the torturous, inconsistent schedule they'd assigned me. There was no organization. Every week they'd tell me I had to work nights when it was supposed to be mornings, and that always bothered me. But I couldn't protest. It was my job, and I had to follow orders. That night my boss called me again to say the problem hadn't been fixed, and that the new GPS wouldn't arrive for another 3 days. Fortunately, he told me I could continue working. I had the clearance to keep going, but they made me sign a document saying I was responsible for everything since they wouldn't be able to track the truck. I didn't mind, so I went back to work the next day. I said goodbye to my wife, my mother, and headed to the company. My boss was waiting for me there with the delivery documents, and we went through our routine as usual. The break had done me good, and little by little, I started to leave behind that feeling of being watched. I prayed to God that it was nothing, that my wife and I were just overreacting. I got into the truck and drove as I usually did. It was about 2 in the morning when I started to feel a strange chill. My skin prickled, and I feared I might lose control of the truck and veer off the road, so I slowed down a bit until I could feel better. But that never happened. And then, the real terror began. The motorcycles and black cars appeared again, overtaking me and slowing down in front of me, forcing me to stop completely. I thought it was a robbery. At least that's what I assumed when I tried to speed up to ram them and get away. But then a motorcycle pulled up next to my driver's side and the rider pointed a gun at me, yelling at me to stop, so I had to comply. They dragged me out of the truck, tied me up, blindfolded me, and hurled insults at me, ordering me to shut up and not resist. They threw me into one of the cars, and we drove for a long time. I lost track of how much time passed before they pulled me out and threw me into an abandoned room on what looked like a ranch. And there, they had my wife too. Thank God they hadn't done anything to her, but that's when they told us why we were there. It turned out that my father had left an unpaid debt with the cartel, a protection fee for his business. For those who don't know, it's a kind of extortion where a criminal group demands regular payments from a person just for running a business or owning property in what they consider their territory. The debt had to be paid immediately, or they would take it out on us with our lives. They knew my mother had enough money to pay it, but to send a stronger message. They hurt me badly. They beat me with boards, covered my face with a cloth, and poured water on me until I couldn't breathe. The suffering went on all night. I'm only relieved that for some reason they spared my wife. By some miracle they didn't harm her, apart from the psychological trauma of watching me endure all that. In the morning, they had already contacted my mother to arrange the payment. If everything went according to plan, they said, we would be released alive. Hours passed, and they picked up the money where they told her to leave it. They partially kept their word. Instead of leaving us where we were, they tied our arms and legs and dumped us on the side of the highway under the midday sun. We suffered from the heat for a long time, but at least we were relieved to be free. It took a couple of hours before a car finally spotted us lying on the ground and rescued us. They took us straight to the hospital, where I contacted my mother, and we reunited. After everything we went through, we survived and managed to settle the debt with those people. This isn't a paranormal story community, but it's a horrifying experience that many business owners face every day. People just trying to make a living, only to end up threatened and robbed of their peace and tranquility. Fortunately, I survived to tell my story. Good evening to all. To this day, I still can't find an explanation for what happened to me that night. The night I was just breaking in a new trailer. I don't know if it was a ghost, a demon, or simply a hallucination. But the truth is, it left me deeply disturbed. I keep praying to God to let me forget that night, but it seems I never will. At the time, I had only been working as a truck driver for 2 years, single and without any responsibilities. I lived with my brother and sister, both older than me and also single. She was divorced and he wasn't into serious relationships, he just liked to have fun. Neither of them had kids, and the only one who ever talked about having them someday was my sister. We didn't have any plans for that. It would take years before we settled down, but it wasn't going to happen then. I felt good. It was a time when the three of us were inseparable despite being adults. We liked spending time together, despite the occasional fights, but in the end, we were siblings. I was the only one who refused to go to college. I didn't like the idea of university, and I never decided on a career, so my dad helped me get a job as a truck driver, and that's where I've been ever since. This story begins on what I thought was just any other night. I was driving as usual through the dark night, drinking some hot coffee I had bought at a gas station. I filled up my thermos so I wouldn't have to stop again, and it helped me stay awake. I was relaxed, looking forward to arriving in the next city by morning to make my delivery and start the trip back. Then, I noticed something strange happening with the steering wheel. All of a sudden it locked up and I couldn't turn it. I threw my coffee aside and put both hands on the wheel, trying to regain control, but when I couldn't, I decided to hit the brakes. That's when I got my second shock. The brakes didn't work. A nightmare no driver ever wants to experience. The truck had multiple failures, making the crash inevitable. I collided with a trailer coming from the opposite direction. Since I couldn't control the steering wheel, it veered slightly to the left until I ended up in the other lane, and both vehicles crashed. What saved me was that when I let off the accelerator, the speed decreased. That, and with God's help, saved my life. They rushed me and the other driver to the emergency room, but it took hours to get there. I was unconscious the whole time, but they told me it took at least 2 hours before anyone came to help us. Maybe I woke up at some point, but I don't remember. And honestly, I'm grateful for that because it would have been a psychological torment. A few weeks later, I was discharged, and luckily I didn't lose my job. But the company's mechanic did. They found that the failures were due to his negligence, a case of poor maintenance, and well, it cost him his job. When I returned to work, my boss told me he had a new trailer waiting for me. It was originally meant for a newly hired driver, but because of the trouble I'd been through, they gave it to me. I had a lot of respect for that man, and maybe that's why I didn't make a bigger deal about the accident. Plus, one of the executives was a close friend of my father, and he knew it wasn't their fault. My first delivery with the new trailer was at night. I did all the paperwork with my boss and then set off on my route. I wasn't shaken by the accident or anything. Things like that happened once in a million. My siblings did advise me to quit that job, but I flatly refused. Honestly, I couldn't see myself doing anything other than driving a truck, and since I survived without any permanent damage, I considered it a blessing from God and motivation to keep going. What I didn't know was that, along with the blessing of keeping my job, I'd also be unfortunate enough to witness something paranormal. I don't know exactly what time it was, but suddenly, in the middle of the road, I started hearing the cry of a baby. out of nowhere and without any logic to it. I couldn't tell if my ears were playing tricks on me, or if the accident had left me with some kind of brain damage. The sound was too loud, and I had no choice but to stop in the middle of nowhere and check the cargo in the back. It was completely absurd. The trailer was separate from the cab where I was driving. No sound, no matter how loud, should have been audible. Plus, I was driving. The noise from the engine and everything else should have drowned it out. I checked the cargo, and not seeing anything, I assumed it was just my imagination. So, I kept going. But the sound came back minutes later. Only, before I could pay attention to it, I saw a woman several meters ahead in the distance, still within the range of my headlights. Naturally, it struck me as strange, but since she was standing in the middle of the road, I had no choice but to stop. The woman walked up to my door without doing anything else, just staring at me. I figured she was waiting for me to get out, and I had two choices: get out or hit the gas and get out of there. I thought it could be a ghost, so I didn't want to offend her, and I got out of the truck. She pointed to the back of the truck, where the baby's crying was still coming from, implying that it was the baby she was looking for and that she wanted me to open the trailer. I was frozen at that point. I don't know where I found the courage to walk to the back, open the trailer, and let her inside. She climbed in without any problem, without holding on to anything, and walked through the cargo until she reached the far end where I couldn't see her anymore. Seconds later, she returned, holding something in her arms. I guessed it was the baby, though I never actually saw it. I couldn't believe what was happening. If there really was a baby there, I can't say for sure if it was a living being, or something else making those sounds. The woman got off the truck again with no difficulty, then disappeared into the woods until her figure was gone. After that, I continued on my way, and I never heard the crying again. My siblings didn't believe me when I told them about it. They thought the accident had left me with some kind of head trauma and that I should undergo more tests, but I didn't listen to them. I just kept living my life, still certain of what I saw that night. I know many are going to criticize me, and I don't blame them, but at least they should try to put themselves in my shoes. I was going through a critical situation. My family needed me, and failing was not an option. I don't care if people judge me. I know my son is fine, free from all harm. Or at least I hope so. I'm keeping my identity anonymous. Many people know who I am, but not what I did, not with as much detail as I'm about to share in this story. It all started when my wife and I decided to move in together. It was just the two of us. I was working in a fast food restaurant at the time, and fortunately, my salary was enough for us to get by, but we obviously aspired to more. Owning our own house, getting a car, and all that were our goals. But then things started to happen that we hadn't foreseen, and everything got complicated. The day my wife told me she was pregnant was the same day I got fired from my job. It almost felt like the beginning of a cruel joke life was playing on us, but it was reality. I had no job and no way to make money, while a baby was growing in my wife's belly. At first, things were okay given the circumstances. We were excited about the idea that our first child was on the way and all that, but then the lack of money became painfully obvious. What we ate during the day was barely enough for the two of us. I went into as much debt as possible to buy things for the baby's birth, the crib, diapers, and we were left with just enough money for food. We knew we couldn't go on like that. It would have been disastrous. I prayed to God, begging for the situation to improve and for me to somehow find a job, but no one would hire me. No company, no local business, nothing. It was incredible how bad luck seemed to be constantly with us. I couldn't sleep at night thinking about how quickly the months were passing and how soon my son would be born. That's when an idea started creeping into my mind, one my wife would never approve of. But desperation made me consider it to the point where it became an option. You see, when I was a kid, I was very close to my grandmother, who had a lot of knowledge about black magic. She didn't teach me how to practice it, but she taught me the theory. That's how I knew the procedure for a ritual to sell my soul in exchange for whatever I wanted. As the days went by, I found myself tempted by that alternative, until I finally decided to go through with it. One night, while my wife was fast asleep, I went to the living room. There, I gathered the materials for the ritual. For obvious reasons, I'm not going to explain the step-by-step process or what's required to do it. That's not my intention. But the point is that when I did it, I spent several minutes kneeling on the floor, waiting for something to happen, all while keeping my eyes closed. Then, a man spoke to me. He was standing right in front of me and told me to get up because he couldn't stand seeing me humiliated like a fool. I obeyed. His face was a bit strange, and I couldn't tell if he was a man or a woman, but I went with man simply based on his deep voice. I asked him if he was the devil, and he didn't respond. He looked at me with no expression, cold as ice. I decided to get straight to the point and told him that I wanted a job, that I needed to do well and have money by the time my son was born. He moved closer to me and whispered in my ear that he would give me all that, but that one day he would come back to collect on the deal. I told him I didn't care what he wanted as long as he helped me and stayed away from my family. I begged him not to take the lives of my wife or my future son. He agreed, and seconds later, I passed out. I woke up at dawn to a phone call from a shipping company offering me a job. That same day, I started working as a truck driver. My boss liked me, as did my coworkers, and I completed my first delivery without any problems. When I got my first paycheck at the end of the month, it was pure happiness at home. My wife greeted me with a nice meal, and little by little, we started buying more things for our baby. The months went by, and the day of the birth arrived. We had a room just for him because we had moved into a larger, more comfortable apartment. My salary was enough for so many things. We were so happy, until the time came when that demonic entity started to collect its part. The first news I received was the death of my uncle. He was killed in such a violent way that I'd rather not describe it. It felt very personal. I attended the funeral, and it was a heartbreaking day for everyone. I refused to connect it to what I had done, but the thought wouldn't leave my mind. But things didn't stop there. Another horrible experience happened when I was driving at night. The road was deserted and dark. I couldn't see the moon through the cloudy sky, and all I could see was what the truck's headlights illuminated. In the early hours of the morning, I started hearing voices asking me, "Why did you do it?" There were many voices in my head, questioning and accusing me of my uncle's death. I had to slow down the truck and eventually stop to avoid an accident. As the night wore on, the voices disappeared. I was going crazy. I didn't know what had happened, but I kept it a secret from my wife and everyone else. I thought it was the devil's way of tormenting me, making me believe I had indirectly caused my own uncle's death, someone I loved and grew up with. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, and they did. One day, our little boy out of nowhere suddenly came down with a high fever that lasted for several nights. We had to rush him to the emergency room, and while we were there, the tests revealed something we were never prepared for. He was diagnosed with leukemia, a chronic form of leukemia that would only get worse over time. This terrible news has only one cause, and it's all because of that damn money. I know telling this won't help, but I know that some will believe me and understand that I did it for my family, so that my son would never lack anything. Later on, I had to confess to my ex-wife what I had done, and after countless arguments, she decided to leave, taking our son far away. I haven't seen him since, but I hope he's okay. He must be. The devil promised not to take their lives, but as I should have known, he worked his evil by leaving us with a lifetime of suffering. Many people believe that evil takes the form of spirits or demons to torment us humans, but I disagree with that. I can't believe it after what I experienced during the time I worked as a truck driver, and in this story that I am about to tell you, I will reveal that I saw it up close. At that time, I lived with my mother and my 5-year-old son. My wife had died during childbirth, and since then, we had lived together. It was hard at first when my little one was just a baby, but I thank my mother who was always there for me and never turned her back on me. I don't know what my life would have been without her. Little by little, I created that family environment for my son that he needed, and thanks to my job as a truck driver, he never lacked anything. One day I saw on the news that a truck driver had been found dead, hanging from a tree in the woods, while his trailer had overturned on the opposite side of the road. The accident didn't add up, and the version given by the authorities contradicted the images they showed. It really made me think, and I debated it with my colleagues at the company that same morning. Everyone agreed with me that if he had crashed on one side, it was impossible for the body to be found on the other, not even if he had jumped. Shortly after, the family of the deceased accused the authorities of negligence, revealing that the body had multiple wounds that must have been caused by a sharp object. They fought to get to the bottom of it, but in the end, nothing came of it. This situation worried us all because most of the time we drove on that same road, and the nights became more unsettling after that incident. And that wasn't the only thing that happened. Over the next month, 2 other bodies were found in truly terrifying conditions. Only a criminal gang could have done something like that. What was really disturbing was that the cars were sometimes left untouched, and nothing was stolen, almost like it was something personal against the victims. Things got really eerie at the company the day we were told that one of our colleagues had been found dead on that same road. His truck had veered off the road and was destroyed. Once again, the controversy arose because the body was found far from the truck, with wounds that must have been caused by some kind of weapon. We stopped making night deliveries for a week, but it couldn't last. It wasn't convenient for the company, and we had to get back to it. After that, it wasn't long before another truck driver was found dead. My family told me I should quit that job because it was too dangerous, and they were afraid that one day they would hear that I was one of the victims. I would be lying if I said I didn't think about it, but I was never going to find such a good job anywhere else. I couldn't afford to quit and end up unemployed for who knows how long, so I stayed. Something many of my colleagues didn't do. Some quit without a second thought, claiming their lives were more important than a well-paying job. That's how I ended up being assigned a night delivery, and the fear became worse. I didn't know how to react, but it was inevitable given how many drivers had quit. They weren't going to be replaced overnight, and I couldn't refuse the assignment. I went to the company for the cargo and set off on the route. It was around 1 in the morning when I saw some lights from a parked car in the distance. I figured it must have broken down or had a flat tire, so I stopped beside it and shouted for someone to come out. That's when I heard a woman screaming for help, and one of the doors opened. Out came a regular-looking man, the kind you'd never suspect of committing a crime. He ignored my presence and dragged the woman out of the car, pulling her toward the woods surrounding us. At that moment, I got out of my truck and approached the car, still hearing the woman pleading for help. I couldn't abandon her. I don't know where I found the courage, but I ran into those dark woods, running full speed with a tool I had grabbed from my truck to defend myself against the man. My heart was pounding, and the woods were silent except for the crunching of branches and the muffled screams of the woman. I crept closer, hiding among the bushes until I saw them. The man was struggling with her, trying to silence her. With more fear than bravery, I shouted a threatening cry to distract him, and the man turned toward me with fury in his eyes. I threw the tool I was holding and hit him in the arm, causing him to release the woman momentarily. She seized the opportunity to run toward me, but the man tried to grab her again. Without thinking, I grabbed her and we both ran toward my truck, hearing the man's fast footsteps closing in. Just as we reached the truck, I hurriedly climbed into the cab, started the engine, and locked the doors just as he reached us, furiously pounding on the windows and shouting threats. I hit the gas and we sped away quickly. As we drove down the road, the woman, trembling, could barely find the words to thank me. I drove nonstop until we reached a well-lit gas station a few miles ahead, where we called the police. Later, when the authorities arrived and arrested the man, I found out that it wasn't the first time he had attacked someone. He was a wanted criminal for the crimes in the area. The woman was safe, and though I was still shaken and full of adrenaline, I felt relieved that I had intervened. As soon as I could, I resigned from my job, and since then I haven't set foot on that road again. I moved out of the city with my family as soon as I had the chance because I didn't want to expose them to a danger like that. The terror from the living can happen at any moment, when we least expect it.